Welcome to A Growing Concern. Well, here it is a few days past the last election, and we're going to get away from the politics. We've been covering that pretty heavy because of the election on November, whatever that was, 4th. I'm going to take a deep breath, and there's a lot of other things going on in this world, and some of them are just as important as the who we elect and the measures that we either pass or don't pass. And tonight I'm going to interview Edith Mirante. She's an author. The name of the book was Wind in the Bamboo, Search of Asia's Negrito Indigenous People. And Edith has been on the program before. She's been on twice. Once she was talking about her experiences in Burma. Here we're going to be talking about, well, I'll just put a quick narrative of travels among hunter-gatherers of ancient heritage and African appearance. Quote, African appearances, surviving in the Philippines, Malaysia, and India's remote Andaman Islands. Their struggles against, this will include their struggles against logging and mining companies. We all know about logging and mining companies around here, and it's the same way around the world. So welcome to the program, Edith.
Thanks, Jim. It's really nice to be back on A Growing Concern. Always a delight.
It's been a while.
Yeah.
Last time we talked about Burma, I believe.
Yeah, my interests have always been in Southeast Asia and indigenous people over there, and after running a human rights project about Burma, which I've done for decades now, I kind of turned to a slightly different topic for this new book.
Mm-hmm. But it's still dealing with indigenous people, though.
Absolutely, and these particular indigenous people were people I'd heard about living in Asia, that there were people deep in the forests there who looked completely different from the other Asians, that they looked more like African people with dark skin and curly hair, maybe a little shorter than the local populations. They were sort of hiding out, and it was almost as if they were a mythical creature, like a leprechaun or an elf. Mm-hmm. But in reality, they're real people, they're contemporary people, they're indigenous people with their own human rights issues. And in 2007 and 2008, I went over to Asia to see if I could actually meet any of them. And I did, in the places where they live now, in the Philippines, Malaysia, and India's Andaman Islands.
So you flew over there. I mean, how did you locate them? How were you able to? They don't speak English, so.
Well, all three of the places are countries where a lot of English is spoken by many people because of the colonial days, the British in India and the British in Malaysia and the Americans in the Philippines, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So I could pretty easily find someone as a contact or a translator.
It was bilingual, right?
Yeah, in a way it was what I do for people with Burma, introduce them to organizations that are standing up for the rights of different indigenous people. So I would find the equivalent of what I do in the Philippines, say, or Malaysia. Mm-hmm. And there are some amazing organizations there that are really trying to help people.
Mm-hmm. So there's just so many directions to go with this. Before I do, so did you go to India as well?
I did. In India, the places where these people live are these little islands called the Andaman Islands. They're actually closer to Burma than to India.
Well, the Burmese people are really dark, too.
Some of them are, and many people in Asia have darker skin or curlier hair, and of course there's mixtures of many different ethnic groups throughout Asia, and especially in Burma. Mm-hmm. The Andaman Islands, these ethnic groups there, some of them had been really isolated on the islands for as long as 18,000 years ago. Mm-hmm. So that's a particularly interesting area to investigate. There are a lot more of the people I'm writing about in the Philippines and Malaysia, but I did do a trip to the Andaman Islands.
Mm-hmm. Well, so scattered out as all these people are, it would seem that they had to have been, you know, arrived by boat, like the sea peoples that came across to Hawaii and across those islands. So they must have had some kind of seafaring skills at one time.
Well, one thing is that these are really ancient people in the countries where they live. Their DNA tests out as the most ancient populations in those particular places. And they traveled out of Africa. You know, the saying is, before there was history, there was African history, back in prehistoric times. So as long ago as 40,000 years ago, their ancestors were walking along the coastlines. And back then there was the Ice Age, so the water levels were different, and there was a lot more land connecting up. So in many places there wasn't even a boat needed to get from place to place. And over a few thousand years, walking along the beach, you can actually reach many faraway places. And that's how their ancestors, and really all of our ancestors, were traveling back then.
Well, according to what I've seen on OPB and places like that, you know, they can trace, I guess through DNA, they can trace all the races of people from just a few groups that came up out of Africa, but it was more than 40,000 years ago, I would imagine.
Not that much more. Well, you know, another 10 millennia or so ahead of that, people left Africa, small group, and then dispersed through the world. Mm-hmm. And these populations probably stayed by themselves for a long time, and then other Asians came in and brought agriculture and brought war and brought slavery. So that made these darker skinned peoples hide deeper and deeper into the forest, as they were really preyed on and hunted by other people who would come into their areas. So
I take it that they probably, as much as can be expected, they probably occupy the lowest rung in all those. They're not even part of society, but they're still, they're still, you know, outcasts, pariahs, or whatever.
I found them, yeah, very, very marginalized in the places where they live now. Mm-hmm. Exploited, looked down upon, and not respected, actually, for what they are, which is these amazing survivors. These ancient people who know the ancient ways of the forests and the seacoast.
And by the ancient ways of the forest, it means that they can walk out into a forest and they understand exactly what's going on around them and how it all fits together, which is something that Western civilization especially lost a long time ago.
Absolutely. Their knowledge of the plants is just legendary. Their knowledge of the creatures, and also things like the weather. They feel often that they can smell a storm coming in, or really sense what's happening with the ocean. So they're very, very in tune with their natural surroundings. Most of them don't have much of what we call a material culture. They're not known for their art or their buildings or anything like that. But they are known for their in-depth in-tuneness with their natural surroundings. Mm-hmm.
Well, I've read about seafaring peoples that can tell how far away land is just by the way the water is flowing by the ship, you know, or by the little boat that they use. So there is so much that can be learned when you're in a situation for 40,000 years or more. It's incredible that we disparage that and don't learn from that.
It is a sad thing, and yeah, it really adds to the richness of our world and our culture the more that you listen to these people.
Mm-hmm. You know, not you mentioned listening to them, were you able to, you probably weren't able to gather much of it, but you were able to listen to some of their folklore and their storytelling and their myths and all?
A little bit. A lot more what I was interested in was really their contemporary lives and the challenges they face from environmental, political issues, not to get back to politics again, but it's always there.
It's impossible to get completely away from it.
There have been many books written about them by anthropologists over the years, some of them quite good, examining their belief systems. But then on the other hand, anthropologists have sort of used them as an example of, you know, primitive man or something like that, without really paying attention to their needs, their lives, their contemporary challenges. Mm-hmm. So they're not really Stone Age humanity or anything. They're really part of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. And so do they all, in all these different places, do they all have separate languages then?
They do. It's been so long since they were taken over by the agriculturalists who came into their land that they've really taken on the other dialects that are around them, except for on those islands off of India. Right. And there they have languages that don't relate much to any other languages, so they're probably very, very ancient ways of speaking.
And so the other places would probably be a conglomeration language of what they originally had and the languages around them, much like all the languages in the world are that way.
Exactly.
So.
Unfortunately, on the Andaman Islands, some of the last speakers of these individual languages have been dying out. It's something we find with Native people in the Americas as well, where the old people are still speaking their original language, and then when they're gone, the language goes with them. So that's really kind of a tragedy that there are so few people left on those islands from some of these groups that the language is vanishing.
Is other people in there trying to document that, like they do with Native American tongues that are disappearing?
They are, to some extent. It would be great if some of the things like the Wampanoag project, you know, in Massachusetts, that's really reviving a language with young people, if some of that could happen with these people, that would be a terrific thing.
That would be. So there's so much to talk about with these people. I'm just really you know, captivated by them. You say that they're shorter and they've been in that area for, you know, the separate areas maybe different lengths of time for 40,000 years, and they've developed pretty much an insular culture. And so part of what I mentioned here, the struggles against logging and mining companies. So these companies are coming in and they're encroaching upon their land. Are they losing a lot of their land, or are they losing a lot of their resources?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, it's been a long process, but nowadays even more so as land gets deforested. Oil palm plantations are being put in Malaysia, which is a terrible, terrible destruction of forest land.
What kind of plantations?
This is oil palm. You know, when you see things made with palm oil in the supermarket, that's the stuff. And it is generally produced in a very unsustainable way. By destroying tropical rainforests and then planting a monoculture of these palm trees. They only last but so long, and then when they're gone, the soil is completely depleted and destroyed.
Well, I think that's what's taken out the orangutan in places.
Exactly, in Borneo.
Yeah.
So that's a terrible challenge, and mining companies throughout the world, and they don't play fair, you know, just about anywhere. They're trying to take over their land as well. So it's very, very hard for people to fight back against these powerful interests.
Sure. Well, so in the Philippines, which has been, you know, over-colonized for a long time, and then Malaysia. So these countries, their natural resources have been pretty much, maybe not used up, but tapped pretty severely, and so they're moving into these folks' areas then. Yeah,
absolutely, and they're, you know, vulnerable people without any real political power. Really, if they, you know, there's one thing to sum up from my book, it's that Indigenous people need their land rights. That's the most important thing for them. Without your land, there go your children, your culture, everything else, because they have such an attachment to their land, particularly the forests. But the sense of place is very, very strong in their culture, and that's very much in danger.
That's very much in danger, sure. I think when, you know, that's the whole idea behind, you know, the government of and for and by the people, and then we own this land is supposed to belong to the citizens of this country. And so there is that knowledge a couple hundred years ago that a people cannot be separated from their land, although slowly we are being, and it's happening other places, but at least here we have somewhat something to say about it. We have the National Environmental Policy Act and different ways of public input to what the government is doing, and places like this, these folks probably don't have any say, and I imagine that the people of the regular citizens don't have anything to say about it either, more than likely.
India, Malaysia, and the Philippines are all democracies. They're flawed democracies, just like ours is.
Just like ours is, yeah.
Absolutely. And yeah, the lower in society you are, the least power you have, the farther from the elite, the more difficult it is. Land rights are a huge, huge issue in the Philippines in general. They're very elite families that own way too much of the land in the Philippines, and inviting mining companies in just compounds the situation extremely.
Extremely. Well, they're usually international international resource extraction companies that have an incredible amount of power. They got the banking system behind them and all that. So, I imagine that it might be a good time to move along. You say you had a series of photographs of the different from the 3 different places?
I do. I've brought along a few photographs. Some of them are historical ones that I found in my research, and we can just kind of run through them on my laptop here.
All right.
And I'll tell you a little bit about them.
All right, that'd be great, because I was thumbing through your book, and some of these are in your book.
Yes. Yeah, my book is published by Orchid Press over in Asia, and they make a really nice looking book. They have color pictures and everything. This is a picture from a medieval source, really, Chinese illustrator for the Spanish colonists in the Philippines, showing that they called these people the Negritos or Negritos, and that's not a great term for them. Negrito, the Spanish meaning a small, dark-skinned person, but it's really the only general term for the people in all those 3 places. So it's still in use, but I put it in quote marks in my book. So they were kind of intriguing to the people around them. They wondered, who are these people when the Spanish first arrived? They called them Ethiopians, in fact, even though they were in the Philippines. And the places where they're found, you can see on the map of the Indian Ocean, you know, if you start over on the side of Africa, you can see how the ancestors walked up through the Arabian Peninsula and then along the coast of India.
That'd be like on the far left, coming up and around into India there.
Yes, there's the original walk along the beach. And then down below Burma are those Andaman Islands I was talking about. They're just little tiny specks of island in the Indian Ocean. And then the mainland of Malaysia is another place where these people are still found. And then the islands of the Philippines. To the other side there.
I can see how there could easily have been land bridges there.
Yes, doesn't it sort of make sense that, you know, when the water levels were different, that could happen.
Sure. And then some of these folks would have continued on northeast up into China.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then, the European ancestors, they were up in Central Asia and then came over the other direction. So not only the Asian neighbors were intrigued with them, the colonists, especially when the British came to this area, they really...
in the Philippines?
Especially in India and Malaysia. In India, they really liked to examine these people. It was a scientific fad at the time in the Victorian days, was trying to rank all the different so-called races of humanity. They wanted everyone in a category. And the less like the tall, white British scientist you were, the more inferior they decided you were. So they would do these horrible things like measuring the children with these apparatus, or measuring people's skulls, stealing the bodies of people just to use them for scientific purposes. And it wasn't really good science, of course. It was just this artificial way to measure and separate all the different races, and then decide that the British were at the top as a way to justify their colonial taking over of these countries.
Well, I've read that back in those days they had something called, was it phrenology, where they could tell a lot about a person by the bumps on his head. There's different studies that they made, and you know,
they decided that certain people were criminal by the way their faces looked, including my Irish ancestors, who were defined as, you know, ape-like and so on by the British scientists at the time. They were inherently inferior because you looked more like apes. This is a picture from the Philippines.
Oh, they are short.
Well, you know, they always had these big, tall white guys next to them, so they weren't necessarily that short, but it was a comparison thing. And these are soldiers from the United States Army. A lot of Americans don't realize that we fought a war in the Philippines back at the turn of the 20th century.
Well, that was America's, United States' first move into empire.
Exactly. It was a colonial war. The body counts were very, very similar to the war in Iraq, as far as the huge casualties in the Philippines, and quite a lot of American casualties there as well. and really for no huge purpose in the Philippines at the time. It was very controversial. Mark Twain spoke out against the war. There was waterboarding at the time, so many of the issues that came up again during the Iraq War started out in the Philippines War.
I had never heard that.
And what the U.S. used to justify the Philippines War was portraying the Philippines as African-looking black people in grass skirts. They were called savages. They were called even much worse than that, as a way to say that the Americans had to go in and take over this terrible country and bring civilization to it. Of course, in reality, the Filipinos, many of them were highly educated. It was a Catholic country from years of Spanish colonialism. And this was, of course, terribly resented by the Filipinos who were fighting for their own freedom, because when the United States had come in and said, we're free from the Spanish, and instead the U.S. then started to take over themselves. So this is a cartoon showing Uncle Sam with, having grasped onto the Philippines, and they're portraying the entire nation of the Philippines like one of these Negrito tribes people.
They could easily put a Native American child in his arms too, because that's just right out of their playbook is what they did here, and called them savages and heathens and subhuman.
It was a complete reprint and yet another example of the westward migration. There's a book which kind of compares the westward conquering of the United States to then it went further into across the ocean to the Philippines, in fact.
And it just kept going.
And then they took some of these people from the Aita tribe, one of these so-called Negrito tribes, to the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1904. And they put them on display as a native village. And again, this was a way to justify the American colonization of the Philippines by saying, look, these are these very primitive, very savage people, and that's the Philippines. So that led to more resentment in the Philippines of these indigenous people. Instead of respecting them, they wanted to distance themselves from them. These were postcards that were sold at the World's Fair, and they labeled one of the men as the missing link. So it was a very demeaning experience for them. There were other native peoples at that World's Fair. Even Geronimo was put on display there, in fact, after his captivity.
I'm not surprised.
And there were Igorot indigenous people from the Philippines put on display at that World's Fair, who then came to the Lewis and Clark exposition here in Portland. So this was a whole thing of sort of colonial display of the conquered people. Well, nowadays, people actually still do live in the forest. These are people I met in Malaysia. They're deep inside the national park. They're allowed to be in there, but it's really the only intact forest that they can still survive in. So it's kind of sad that only in a national park can you still have enough land to roam and hunt and gather and raise your children in the old free way, nomadic.
Is there any attempt to keep their population down so they don't? Of course, they tend to keep their population down according to the area they live in.
Exactly. They generally have had kind of small families. That goes with being a hunter-gatherer often. You have a nice small family group. The gender roles are very egalitarian in the hunter-gatherers. Sometimes the men take care of the babies and the women go out hunting. There's not a lot of hierarchy. There aren't really chiefs or headmen or anything like that.
It's more
usually
matriarchal than.
Not even matriarchal. It's just like everybody does what they do, you know? It's very equal. And a lot of what they're trying to escape in Malaysia is their children being taken away. Another echo of what happened to the Native Americans.
And I'm sure in India as well.
In many places. In Malaysia still, children are being taken away to boarding schools. They don't have their local dialect anymore. They don't have their religion anymore. They often try to run away. I called a chapter in my book Rabbit Proof Fence in reference to the great movie about the Australian Aborigine children running away from the boarding school. And, you know, here we are in 2014, and this is still happening to indigenous people in our world, that their children are just being taken away and their culture being destroyed that way. So one of the things that I did while I was researching the book was to take pictures of people with their consent and then bring those pictures to the people in the other country. So the people in the Philippines here are looking at my photos that I took of the people kind of like them in Malaysia.
Oh, wow.
And they didn't know that other people like them existed out there in the world. And they would look at the pictures and say, oh, this is a family resemblance. You know, this, you know, looks like
Sure.
your cousin or your uncle. So whether or not their DNA matches up, they did feel a kind of a kinship to each other when they saw pictures of each other.
Now you say that they live in these 3 different places now. Is it just one group in this island off of India and one group in Malaysia, or are they different groups scattered throughout within each one of those 3 places?
There are some different groups in each of those places that speak slightly different dialects, have slightly different histories and experiences. In the Philippines, there are quite a few different groups. There's a population of 40,000 of these people in the Philippines, so that's considerable.
That's pretty good size. Yeah.
Maybe about 4,000 in Malaysia, and just a few hundred on the islands off the coast of India.
And they're small islands, so there couldn't be that many.
Well, also, that's the effect of the British colonialism, because the British decided they were going to civilize these people. They took them away to make them into servants, and they got the diseases of the colonists and were really wiped out. It was basically a genocidal
another echo
situation.
of what happened here then.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yes.
And it's still happening here too, by the way.
It's still happening here in many places. And this is Mount Pinatubo, or what's left of it. This is the big volcano that exploded in 1991 in the Philippines, pretty similar to our Mount St. Helens in scope. And this had been the homeland of the Aita indigenous people. And they had actually warned about the volcano. They saw something strange happening up there, and they went to warn the powers that be down in Manila about it, and probably saved a lot of lives by doing that. But when the volcano erupted, that really changed the whole center of their universe. It was where their god lived, and it was where they lived. So they had to come down below and learn how to live with the lowlanders. At the time, especially, there were some of the Catholic nuns who used the liberation theology that was used in Latin America to empower people through teaching them adult literacy, teaching them how to stand up for their rights a little more. So that made a big difference for these people who had been really torn out of their mountains and their forests. This is Jesse Reyes. He's from the Aita tribe, and he was my guide to the, it's called climbing Mount Pinatubo, but there's not much to climb anymore. It's more of a little hike because
blew it
it's
apart, huh?
very diminished, yes. But it's an interesting landscape. The word lahar is used, which means the ash flow and mud. If you go up to Mount St. Helens, you see that lahar flow of the gray, ashy earth now. And very similar in that area. And Jesse, when I took his picture, he took his hat off because he said he wanted to show the other ones, the other tribes people in the other countries, that he too had the curly hair. So he wanted to identify with them.
I noticed a lot of these folks that you're showing are, basically have Western clothes. So there is, that alone shows that there's a lot of influence going on around them.
Yeah, I mean, they are very much the modern people, of our modern day. Some of them still wear loincloths. A lot of them have really nice beaded necklaces and that kind of thing. It's still part of their culture, or flowers in their hair. But, for sure, everybody else, they're wearing cargo shorts like, the rest of the world.
At least he's not holding on to a cell phone.
A few people that I met did have cell phones. I literally met people who were using smoke signals to the next village, but they had heard about cell phones. So it's all forms of communication have been skipped in between the smoke signals and the cell phone.
That's really a jumble there.
And this is one of the examples of organization among the Aita people. This was a big meeting that they had, and spoke out against the mining companies coming to their land, spoke for things that they wanted in terms of jobs or education for their people. So a real kind of indigenous grassroots empowerment that's happening in the Philippines.
So from what you're saying there, you have folks that are wanting jobs and wanting to be at least somewhat a part of the larger society, and there are some that are still living the jungle life then.
There are some who are really, really isolated. There's one island in the Andaman Islands that nobody goes to, that is off limits. They've showed that they're completely hostile to outsiders, and now it's been left alone. And it's a beautiful forested island, about the size of Sauvie Island, with maybe a couple of hundred people living there.
Paradise.
It might just be, you know. I called it the control group against, you know, the rest of civilization. But then in the other areas, I mean, this is reality. They are in the modern society. They may go hunt in the hills on the weekends, but have to take a job the rest of the time. So there are a lot of people in transition now. And this is a demonstration that I went to in Manila against the mining companies. So there were a lot of people from all over the Philippines who were really protesting what the mining companies are being allowed to do, and really trying to get their own government to put a stop to it, or at least have a moratorium on just wholesale destruction of the environment for the sake of extracting minerals.
Oh, I know they have done that. You know, just about used all the mahogany out of those forests, I understand. And the deforestation is terrible.
And these two things go hand in hand in many places. In fact, in Malaysia, the forests were cut down, the oil palm plantations went in, and now that it's just bare dirt, the mining companies are going in there. So what are you left with? You're not even left with a bare hillside, you're left with a dirt pit, basically. So
what are they
terribly short-sighted.
What are they mining there?
Oh, there are everything from tin to nickel to copper, you know, whatever the outside world decide that it needs for its latest gadgets.
And they have a lot of it there, apparently.
Yeah,
then.
Unfortunately. It's like what they call the curse of resources. When your country has these so-called natural resources, but it doesn't benefit anybody, really, except for some of the elite business people.
Well, I've always said that it's not a resource, it's a source.
Right.
You know, and if you look at it as a resource, it's a whole different switch in the way you look at the world and your relationship to it by looking at it that way, rather than the Ita people probably looked upon it as, you know, source of their religion, their ritual, all that.
Exactly.
And that's gone, at least to a lot of intents and purposes, and it's good to see this isn't the people that we're talking about that are doing this. The actual Philippine people are trying to protect the land as well.
Many of them are. Yeah, there's a great civil society in the Philippines, and a lot of people who organize against, you know, to fight the power, basically. And yeah, this is a slide I have about what we were talking about, the palm oil plantations. They really destroy the land. Where it says stripped bare, that's what a palm oil plantation looks like, which was formerly a tropical rainforest. And there are also a lot of fires that are caused in there. They'll burn down what's left of the rainforest in order to plant these oil palm plantations. And there are big companies, like the chart on the left shows Cargill's involvement. So big multinationals are involved in this trade, and there's many, many products in the supermarket contain this.
Well, when we were doing coverage of the move to label our foods GMOs, you know, we talked about that, but I also tried to accent the fact that it's our global food supply that is being dictated to us by these Cargills and Monsantos. You know, the labeling is good, but the fact fact is these corporations are stripping the planet, whether it's in Colombia, whether in South America, where they're putting in, doing the same thing and putting in soy.
Right.
Or
this
you know,
monocrops,
or
yeah.
you know, or McDonald's, all their cattle for their hamburgers. They're doing the same thing to the ground down there, and it isn't just there, and it's a terrible thing that's going on. But it's good to see that everywhere it's going on, people are resisting it.
Yeah, you know, and it's just the tragedy of replacing something as incredibly diverse as a rainforest that has so many products, so many amazing things, and things we use every day, you know, from chocolate to coffee, and then replacing it with just one thing that is, you know, very, very short-sighted.
Short-lived, yeah, that's...
So as much as people try to resist in the Philippines and other places, it can be really a dangerous thing, as we all know. Resistance often comes with a major price, and this is Dexter Condes, and he was assassinated in April 2012 because he was protesting for the land rights of the Ati people on an island called Boracay in the Philippines. This is a beautiful resort island with white sand beaches, and the tourists would never know that it was actually the land of the Ati people originally. And they've been really marginalized. I found them in a very small plot of land, even with a wall in between them and the beach. So a completely unfair situation, and assassination does happen in the Philippines to outspoken activists pretty frequently. There's what they call a culture of impunity, where the assassins are very rarely brought to justice. And that is something that happened to Dexter Condes. On the screen you can see what I think is probably the most beautiful political demonstration ever, which was the small Ati children carrying flowers at Dexter's funeral. There can't be a more poignant kind of protest than that, I don't think. Gradually over the last year or so, the Atis of that island, of Boracay, have gotten more rights to their land somewhat. And they're starting to be a little more protected, but it's unfortunate that someone like Dexter had to die for that to happen.
Well, you mentioned it, you know, that kind of tangentially, but what's going on there is like it's the commodities that we use in our everyday life. Not this and this, but in general, the commodities that make our life comfortable comes from places like that, and is creating those problems.
It's true. It's definitely a global phenomenon. That yes, there is cause and effect there. This is my last picture that I brought with me, and this is from a really, really beautiful place in the Philippines. It's called Northern Sierra Madre National Park. There's no road into that park. You have to either, if you're really lucky, you can get a flight on a small plane, and otherwise you can go by boat or by foot. I've been there a couple of times. It's one place where the Agta people are able to be in the forest and hunt, and they're also able to use the seacoast. This is the ideal thing if you're a hunter-gatherer person, to have access to both of those things, to be able to go back and forth, all the resources of the sea, fish and shellfish, and then what you can find in the forest as well. So this is a typical living structure, a little lean-to that they can just, you know, put up, and it's portable and provides you enough shade, and you can live under that for a while and then go somewhere else.
Don't even have to pack it up and take it with you.
You don't even have to take it with you. We were, you know, I've called my book "The Wind in the Bamboo," and one reason is that these people are very much bamboo cultures, and that's a really renewable resource, something that's always growing, and you can make more things out of it. And they have an amazing ability with bamboo. You can make all kinds of things. But at the same time, you can notice in this picture, they also live in what's been called the plastic age, which is our age.
Oh yeah, right there between the two there.
Yeah, we are definitely people of the plastic age, and they will find things on the beach, like plastic jars or jugs that have washed up on the beach, and then use them, because that's what they do. They're people who can gather up whatever is around them, reuse it, maybe repurpose it. And that's part of the way that they have survived all these millennia, and, and may well survive much longer, aside from the many stresses of the modern world.
And maybe longer than us in the long run. You
I think that's very possible, actually.
They give a whole new meaning to the word gatherer and hunter-gatherer. So.
Right, and survivor. This isn't like, you know, the TV show Survivor. These are really the people who can go to an island and can live, you know, completely in harmony with nature and not against nature.
Sure. Well, just like this Northwest, I mean, if you know, you could go out in the woods and you would never starve, probably even in the winter. And I'm sure those islands are even more plentiful. Abundance.
Yeah. My book actually starts and ends on the seacoast of our own Pacific Northwest, because of course we did have amazing cultures here, the native people who lived on this side of the Pacific Ocean in a totally sustainable manner until they met colonialism and they began to vanish, but then they never really did vanish. A lot of people talk about vanishing people or vanishing races as if it was some inevitable process and, oh, that's too bad. But in reality, there's always something can be done to stop that process. And in many cases, it comes from the people themselves, as with our own areas, native people who have resisted all along and for that reason have survived. And the people in the Philippines who are resisting now, and for that reason will survive everything.
I noticed quite a few of these with the Ita people.
Yes.
And that's probably because there was 40,000 of those, and there was more of them. So you probably were able to spend more time and interact more with them because there was more of them in a larger area.
Yes, in the Andaman Islands, access to these indigenous people is very restricted, and I respected that. You don't want a lot of outsiders running around in their forest areas and their islands, because you can spread disease if you go there on purpose, or even if you're well-meaning. So I did stay out of those areas, and only met a few people who are actually living in the towns or along an area where it wasn't restricted. But in Malaysia and the Philippines, it's quite different, so their access was much more available, and I made a lot of friends there among these people who, some of them send me email now, or I can communicate with them in other ways, and that's really been a privilege. It's really been terrific to meet these people and have the chance to let them tell their stories to me. I can tell their stories a little bit, and then in the future I'm sure they'll be telling their own stories to the world even more.
Especially with social media and all that, they're able to have access to that. Well, you mentioned this is your last picture, and so that brings up the point that you're going to be doing a PowerPoint. I don't know, it's probably a little more extensive than this PowerPoint.
Yeah, this was the brief version of it.
But you're going to be
taste of it.
You're going to be doing that on November 19th at the World Affairs Council. There we go.
There you go.
And so we can talk a little bit about that. This is going to be basically just what you're doing here, only more than just photographs, I take it.
Yeah, this is really the launch for my book. My publisher is in Asia, and it's been out in Asia for a while, but this is the U.S. debut of it here in Portland, Oregon. And I'll be showing more extensive slides, more historical background, but also more of the pictures that I've taken. I don't consider myself a great photographer, but these people are really beautiful, and I managed to get some good pictures of them.
Well, you wouldn't have to be an expert to be able to show what these folks are all about. It seems like to me, it really came through very, very clearly. You know that, and to me, their flexibility and their perseverance. I mean, they're wearing Western clothes and they're interacting with you. You're talking about emails and all that. But it would sadden me if they were moving forward and they were leaving everything behind. But you're saying that there is that contingent of them that is keeping the old ways.
There really is. There's a very strong culture to them. There was one village I went to where the people didn't really look that much different from other people of the Philippines. There had been a lot of intermarriage, and yet they knew they were Ati. They said, we're the Ati people. Their neighbors knew who they were. So there is this kind of a cultural, ethnic identity that transcends what you look like or what you're wearing or any of that. That's really something that a lot of it comes from the stories that you're told. You know, what your grandparents told you, how they showed you what plants to look for, what your food is like, things like that. Now in the Philippines there are some food festivals for these people, which is a nice way to make other people respect them more. They're the ultimate kind of local food movement, and that's something that they can share with other people. And they are very sharing people. In the Philippines, I mean in Malaysia, someone came, a scientist, to these people and said, you know, well, what if somebody from a pharmaceutical company wanted to talk to you about the botanical medical cures that you know how to get from the forest? You know, what would you say to them? And they said, oh, of course we would give it to them because it's nice. So why wouldn't we want to give medicine to everybody?
Because they patented it, that's why.
Yes, it didn't even occur to them that, you know, they should ask for money for it or what their intellectual property rights were, or any of that. It was like, of course we would share that because this is a sharing culture. If they go out hunting, traditionally they would divide up the animal that they got among everybody, even if you only got like a little tiny piece of meat with your dinner. So they have kind of openness, and of course that can be exploited as by pharmaceutical companies coming in and taking away the knowledge that you have and giving you nothing for it. And they've often been exploited for their labor. Like they'll say they're going to help somebody from the lowlands and not realize how much they should actually get money for helping them. But on the other hand, they're nice people to have in the world who have that kind of a culture that's not based on you know what I can get for it.
And to lose that sharing or that gut reaction to just share with people, that would be the measure by which we could measure the fact that they're losing their culture. Not so much that they're wearing Western clothes and using cell phones, is the fact that they don't, just as a reflex, want to share with people, would seem like to me. That's
absolutely true, yeah. If there's like a corrupting effect on people or a selfish effect at some point, that would be a difference. One of the projects I went to in the Philippines is a group called PREDA, which does a lot of really good social justice work in the Philippines. And one of the things they were doing was an organic mango farm, which, I mean, that signed me up. I was like, okay, I'm going to the organic mango farm for sure, because it was mango season and it was amazing. And these are people of the forest. They're not interested in farming usually. To them, that's kind of a come down to have to labor on that very regular, boring basis. But taking care of the mango trees was something that did resonate with them. So that's a good kind of a project because it was something they actually related to. It wasn't somebody just coming in and saying, okay, you know, you can grow rice or, you know, raise pigs or something like that. Instead, it was, what would you like to do? It's like, well, these trees, that might work. And then PREDA dries the mango and sells it, organic mango. Of course, it's organic in Europe. And then the money goes back to them in the fair trade arrangement. So that's the kind of thing that, you know, at least as a transition where you have to have some money or you have to do something like that, takes into account what their normal preferences would be. Sure.
Were those mango trees planted or were they already there?
The mango trees are planted, and then it's a question of kind of looking after them, taking care of them, which is that kind of nurturing thing that they would do normally.
Sure. Well, it's good to see that they are able to make that transition, because unfortunately, as much as you hate to say it, they're going to have to make a transition.
In most cases, that's probably true. There's just not that much intact forest left
except for
in
maybe
Asia.
On those islands you mentioned.
And even there, it's changing. The one island that nobody goes to is called North Sentinel. Nothing has happened much there yet, but there's another place where there's a tribal reserve that has a road running through it. It's supposed to be an intact place for this tribe, and yet there are, you know, trucks and buses of Indian tourists going through all the time. So exploitation happens right along the roadway, even though the Indian government was supposed to close it down. And if people want to know more about that, Survival International is a great organization that supports rights for Indigenous people around the world, and they have a lot on the Andaman Islands situation on their website.
Now that you mentioned it, you know, we've talked about a lot of these issues. Do you have any other websites folks could do some follow-up?
Well, you can go to the website for my book, which is windinthebamboo.com, and through that I have links to Survival International. I have a group in Malaysia, a group in India, so there are a few different groups in each country that are useful.
That's good that you have. You know, you could be more or less a clearinghouse for all those with your book website.
Yeah, I'm trying to be a source at least for people to start to support these Indigenous people who are really such an important part of our history and of our present-day life in the world.
You know, locally here, you know, we just recently had a presentation by Blumenauer and a couple other folks about wilderness, and it's really difficult for me to express why we need wilderness, and we also need people that have that wilderness quote about them, where they can live in the forest and they have these old ways, and then both are just as important, I would think.
It's absolutely true, and it's interesting that some of the people that I met, who I wrote about in this book, live in actual national parks in the Philippines and Malaysia. A lot of times we think of, oh, you know, it has to be a wilderness or a national park without anybody in it. And that's often very damaging to the Indigenous people who may have lived there to begin with. There are many examples of them being driven out of parks, and then it just becomes this sort of nice empty place, which is good, and maybe, you know, people can backpack into it, but it ignores the fact that maybe this was their original land to begin with.
They're part of that biodiversity too.
Absolutely, yes. And in both places, their hunting and gathering is done within the parameters of what the park can handle. So it's pretty good arrangement, I think.
It's good that that can be taking place, because you're going to have a little bit of the old and a little bit of the new, and not so much of a emphasis of the new. And it's good to see that at least that's working out in some places. I'm sure in some places it isn't. And then these folks are being overrun. Yeah. And so before we got a little over 5 minutes left here. It may be off the subject, but I'll just throw a question at you.
Why not?
Is there a similarity in the religious beliefs of these folks? You may or may not know, but I'm just curious.
Interestingly, there sort of is, and so that might point to something really ancient, you know, that traveled on foot for a long time.
Along with the language and the religious beliefs. Yeah.
They often kind of worship a thunder god.
Really?
Somebody up there making that happen. And have some other similar beliefs. I mean, they're what is known as animists, so they believe in and respect the spirits in nature. That's where everything gets the cues from. It's, you know, some spirits in the oceans or the rocks. I mean, not just the animals or the, you know, it can be anywhere in nature. Very heightened awareness of weather, for instance, in their religions. So even though they've probably been separated as people for, you know, millennia, there do seem to be some similarities there.
I would think there would be. And, you know, like John Trudell says, we all came from tribes. We all have those beliefs, and somehow we think that we've become more civilized by getting away from the beliefs of the gods that are in the water and the mountains like Pele in Hawaii, and the one that you mentioned there, the Pinatuba. You know, sometimes you know, in some ways we have moved past that, but I think
powerful stuff in those mountains.
That's right. We've gotten into this way of looking at things now, but we've lost that, and that is as much a part of the reality to me of nature and of life on this planet as the way we look at things now. And we, you know, maybe that's the fall from the Garden of Eden. I don't know, but you know, there's different ways of perceiving that. But it just seems to me that we've probably lost more than we've gained in my way of looking at things.
Right, and you know, I go back to, again, you know, being of the Irish heritage, how we, you know, have always thought of there being these small people, you know, out in the woods and the hills, and perhaps those were our ancient ancestors from these prehistoric migrations as well. So it's not really necessarily mythology. This could just be something that were very deep in all of our DNA or our bones or our spirits.
And they can search that out in our DNA too. They can show that.
Yeah.
I don't know how, but they somehow they always tell you that on OPB and these things, that they can do this and this and this, but they never tell you how.
Right.
You know, but I guess that would be a show in itself.
A whole other kind of science. Right.
Yeah. So we're down to 3 minutes. Maybe we ought to just kind of recap a little bit on the event that's coming up.
Yeah, it'll be at the World Affairs Council of Oregon, and that's in the Oregon Historical Society building. It's on Park Avenue, 1200 Park Avenue.
That's
at
it.
7 o'clock next Wednesday, the 19th of November.
And you will be doing what now?
I'll be giving a slideshow based on my book. So rather than just the, you know, standing up there and reading from my book, I'll show pictures, many of which are in the book, but many of which also aren't in the book. It's $10 to go to the event, and there's registration on their website if you want to do that in advance.
And that would be the website for World Affairs Council?
Yeah, it's worldoregon.org.
All right. So, well, that gives us a couple minutes. The Wind in the Bamboo, what was the rest of that title?
There you go. It's A Journey, because it's really a travel book, and tells how I got to meet these people and how they told me their stories, interwoven with the history and the anthropology of how they were examined over the years, but especially just, you know, this is what it was like to be in the rainforest with them for a night and listen to the insects and listen to the rain coming down on the lean-to, what the experiences were like.
So one of those little lean-tos you were showing, you were actually living with in one of those?
Mine was a little more sophisticated. It had a tarp on it. You know, it's tarps if you're living in the rainforest are not a bad thing.
No.
So it's, again, it's that mixture of a little bit of modern and a little bit of ancient.
Well, you said that a lot of the gods had to do with the weather. Well, you know, you can understand why.
There's some amazing weather in those places.
And you're right there out there living in an area where you're much more dependent upon how the weather changes.
The typhoons in the Philippines are a very destructive thing, even more so as the planet warms up.
That's right.
And
so
that these people have made it through many of those is another testimony to their survival skills.
40,000 years of it. Huh?
Yes.
Well, we're down to about half a minute. I want to thank you for coming on the program, Edith, and I hope you keep me in mind for your next book.
My next book. Thank you so much, Jim. Always a pleasure to be on A Growing Concern.
All right. So looking forward to doing this again in the future, and we're going to also do one on Borneo with John here within a month. But I'll let folks know about that in a couple of weeks when we get that nailed down. I want to thank the crew, and we'll tune in next week. Good night.